So welcome to Let's Develop. I'm your host, Chris Woolley, and we've got a fun episode today. We're going to be looking at artificial intelligence with Aaron Hockley and learning about how artificial intelligence can affect you as a photographer. So if this is your first time joining the show, welcome. This is a fun webinar series brought to you by American Color Imaging, and I want to give a big shout out to them for putting this on and helping us put this on. But basically what we're doing is we're bringing in amazing educators, and they're sharing information with us, the photography community. So you can find the full lineup at acilab.com/let's-develop and kind of see some of the cool stuff that we're going on, some of the amazing webinars. They're recorded and live on there. So kind of fun stuff. If you did happen to miss the last episode that we did with the Munoz brothers, Level Up Your Business, that's definitely worth watching that replay. And it is live on ACI's website. And I'll also email it to you as well if you did register for the show. Basically, they walk us through how they've transformed their business into a multi-million-dollar business and just keep on leveling up that process. It is fascinating to watch and see how those brothers work together and have really, really transformed their business. It's pretty cool. So be sure to check that one out on ACI's website. So this is a webinar format, which means that if you have questions or anything like that, put them into chat that's on to the side. I will be monitoring that, and we'll be able to ask Aaron live and actually get some answers to our questions, which should be pretty cool. So up here, I've got Aaron Hockley, and he is from Washington State, and he is the guy that literally wrote the book on artificial intelligence when it comes to photographers. And he'll talk more about what his book is too, because you're definitely going to want to check that one out if this subject is interesting to you. So for those of you that don't know Aaron, he's kind of a big deal in the industry. He's master photographic craftsman. He has accolades galore. But what's really, really interesting is that when it comes to techie stuff, whether it's AI or anything else from social media to the business to computers, like he's your go-to guy. You're like, all right, Aaron, I need to know what's going on with this. He's got his website, techphotoguy.com, where you can see a ton of great information and resources on there. He also puts on a ton of events as well as doing educational opportunities. So be on the lookout for Aaron because he is just a fire hose of information that comes there. So Aaron, you want to share some information with us about artificial intelligence and photography?
Sure thing, Chris. Thanks for the introduction, and hello to everybody out there watching. I'm excited to be here and glad that American Color Imaging offers this up as a resource to help everybody grow in their photographic ventures. We're going to talk about AI and photography a little bit here today, and the program that I've got, we're going to kind of go through a few different parts. We're going to look at just kind of some of the basics, the words. Let's start by figuring out what the heck do these words even mean? And then we get into, why should I care about it? How does it affect how we capture images with our cameras or with our smartphones? And then how does it affect how we edit images or manage those images? And then we'll kind of wrap up with a look at what does this really mean for the future of photography, both for image capture and for the business world of photography. So to kind of kick things right off. Yeah. And we're going to do that all in the next, 45 minutes. To kick things off, I would love to have everyone drop into the chat box. If are you using AI already in your photography? And if so, how? So just, drop that in, whether that's, something you're using in your camera, something you're using with your editing software.
So let's put into chat. Would that be like things like auto eye focus or using like the select subject in Adobe or what are we talking about with AI here?
Anything like that. And that's kind of, spoiler, we're all probably using it whether we realize it or not. And, so I'm curious, what people think they're doing with it already. And then we'll revisit that at the end and see how it compares.
We're starting to get, so like Tim says, yes, he uses plugins, camera metering. Jeff doesn't do anything. Kimberly's using in Photoshop and Lightroom. Rita's using the Topaz suite. Alan uses it very minimally, mostly with selection stuff. David's in Adobe and Topaz, Jose, Topaz. Luis didn't think about the iFocus until we mentioned it. So it looks like we're using it at least a little bit, but maybe we don't know we're using it.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, that's kind of one of the cool things. I mean, I think you hear about it most often, when, Apple's talking about it as they release a new iPhone, or when Adobe's presenting, hey, here's some new features in the newest version of Photoshop that you can update to. But the reality is it's kind of all around us in the photo world. And so I think artificial intelligence, in the photography world, really kind of represents a third shift, a third big shift and we've had a couple big shifts in the last, say 20, 25 years in the industry. The first one, and I'm sure a lot of you were around for this, was the shift from film to digital cameras, right? Instead of, loading our film with a limited number of exposures per roll and deciding what our ASA, what our ISO was going to be when we loaded the film up, now we had a digital camera, and, we could put a lot of images on a memory card, and we could adjust our settings per shot. And so that was a big shift in the industry. The second big shift that we had, and we've run into, is the shift where kind of the default method of photo distribution now is digital files as opposed to prints. And that's not to say that print isn't still valuable. And as a professional photographer, I want my clients to buy prints for their work. I have prints here in my office. I have metal prints. I have canvas. I have paper. And I've ordered some of those through ACI in the past. And so it's not that print is completely gone, but just if you look at it by the numbers, most images get shared as digital files. If we have a family birthday party, we're not going to probably print out 4x6s and mail those to relatives across the country. We're going to share those on social media, or we're going to, send them to them via text or email. And so that has been a big shift, both in how photographers work and also in the business side of photography for, folks that sell prints. And then with AI, I think the third shift that we're seeing is, digital photography, really up until this point has been a lot about us telling the computer, whether that's our computer or whether that's the computer inside our digital camera, it's been about us telling the computer what we want it to do. And I think the shift that we're seeing with AI is we're starting to be able to trust that computer of some form to make some of those decisions on our behalf, because in a lot of cases, it can make those decisions better than we can. And so that's kind of what we're going to explore a little bit today. So fun stuff. Yeah. So let's start off with the terms. And, the most broad term that we hear about when we talk about all this stuff is artificial intelligence itself. And there's really kind of three subtypes of that. The definition of AI that I like is really just the concept that a computer or machine is going to be able to make decisions that were things we thought were once only able to be done by humans. And with that decision, or with that definition, you'll realize that shifts over time. But the idea, again, is that we're going to let the computer make some decisions on our behalf on something that maybe previously we thought we would have done. And so kind of the three subtypes of artificial intelligence, ASI is artificial superintelligence. That's the concept that there would be a computer system that would be, smarter than any humans currently are. It would be able to make decisions that humans can't even figure out how to make, right? And this is where we get in kind of some of the fun, like futuristic sci-fi, or robots going to take over the world stuff. So we're not diving into that detail today.
No Skynet yet?
No Skynet quite yet. AGI is artificial general intelligence. And this is the idea that like a computer or a robot of some sort, could really be at a level where it can function like a typical human would function, that it could go to a college class and deal with being in that college class and pass the tests at the end of the exam, or that it could go make you a cup of coffee in an environment where, you hadn't made a cup of coffee before, or that it could pass the Turing test where people couldn't tell if they were interacting with a robot or with a human. Again, broader set of concepts than we're going to dive into details today. ANI, though, is artificial narrow intelligence. And this is the idea that a computer, an algorithm, a system, can make decisions on the same level or maybe even a little better than humans for a specific purpose. And we're going to be talking about photography purposes today, but you've probably also thought about other ANI applications. Probably the most common one we hear about a lot is a self-driving car, right? So the idea is that a computer system, a brain in a car, would be able to, navigate the highways, navigate roads, and do so safely, on level with, or maybe a little bit better than human drivers. And so today we're going to talk about some, narrow applications of AI for photography. Another term that you hear and kind of plays right in with artificial intelligence is like, okay, if we have intelligence, if these computers are going to be able to figure this stuff out, is machine learning. And machine learning really just means, the way that this computer system, learns how to do these decisions that we want it to make. And kind of what differentiates this from like a traditional computer program or piece of software is that with traditional software, the software developer kind of has to tell the computer all the possible things it might need to do and how to make those determinations. Whereas with AI, the computer figures some of that out on its own based on, an evolution of, what it learns. And the way that it learns is through training data. And this is just, giving it lots and lots of data to learn from, and so when we talk about things like, how a computer can go through, your Apple Photos library or your Lightroom library and identify, these are photos of my wife, these are photos of my son, these are photos of, Chris Woolley, our host. It's not because a computer programmer at Adobe programmed in, here's what Chris Woolley looks like into Lightroom. It's because probably the first time I had some photos of Chris, I told Lightroom, hey, these are photos of Chris. And then the computer's smart enough to learn from those photos and find other similar photos that it thinks are also Chris. Another term that you might hear is the concept of a neural network. And this is just the notion of lots and lots of kind of distinct decisions being made. And it comes from the concept of a neural network, like in the human brain, where neurons, the way that the brain works is that there are, thousands, millions of these neurons that all work simultaneously together to all solve tiny little pieces of a problem and then bring that all together to a result. And artificial neural networks do the same thing, except with computers. And so, when you hear the term neural network or, Adobe talks about neural plugins, Apple has a neural processing unit in the iPhone. The idea is that this is hardware and software optimized to make these kinds of decisions. And the last term I want to mention is computational photography. You'll hear Apple uses this a lot when it talks about the features of, Apple Photos and the iPhone. It's kind of a broad term, and it really just comes down to images being made, not just with kind of the things we traditionally think of making images, such as, optics and physics and light and things like that, but all of that combined with computers that in many cases can give us results that are, better and beyond what's been possible through traditional means. So these are kind of just the basic terms. Any questions about any of those terms? We're going to dive into more of like how they actually apply to our cameras and our software. But are there any terms that anybody's really confused about I should address before we go further?
Question, I don't know if it's appropriate on this one, but Michael wants to know if ASI, AGI could be used with taking a digital picture.
They could be. Yeah. I mean, and, there have been... there have been some, Google released a device called the Google Clips camera several years ago, which the idea was you would like clip it on. It kind of had a dual meaning there. You would clip it onto you or whatever. And as you walked around and interacted with stuff, it would decide when it thought it was an interesting moment to take a picture. And so it was trying to use AI to decide, this is an interesting time to take a picture. It was not super successful commercially. It was an interesting concept, but it did apply some of those things.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So I mentioned that the way that AI learns is through training data, right? And so, we talked about like classifying, pictures of people. The other way that AI learns is, not just classifying pictures of people, but classifying all number of different things. A lot of the applications of AI in photography have to do with the computer being able to, very quickly figure out like, what is this? And then what sort of a decision should I make based on what this thing is? And so that's going to kind of be a theme as we look at some specific applications of AI in photography. So let's talk about AI in our cameras, right? And, as we started out, Chris made reference to like, eye autofocus or eye tracking focus and things like that. And that's a great example of some artificial intelligence that we have in a lot of our cameras now. If you go back 15 years, if you were, tracking a moving subject and you wanted to make sure that that eye was in focus, well, that's going to involve you as the photographer moving that camera around. You might have used you might have relied on a continuous autofocus mode or something like that, that would help you out. But when it comes to things like eye autofocus, first the camera has to even know what an eye is, right? First it has to know what the face is. And once it finds the face, what's the eye within the face? And so this is a good example of, again, figuring out what is something and then how do I make a decision based on that? One of the other things that's interesting if we talk about AI in our camera, would be the concept, face detection as a whole. But there's also AI powered modes sometimes in our camera, right? So if we look at, night sight or night mode on our modern smartphones, this is a case where, the camera system on the smartphone, makes a whole bunch of interesting decisions on how to make a realistic looking picture, even though, kind of by all the laws of physics, there's not enough light, right? We know as serious photographers who probably have bigger cameras that, the bigger the image sensor, the bigger the lens, generally, we have physics advantages, right? There's a reason why the sports shooter on the side of the NFL game has a giant lens. It's not because he likes to carry it around because of the weight for fun. It's because it takes that big of a lens to capture that image that he wants to make. Well, if you compare that to the physical size of the lens on your iPhone or your Android phone, those lenses are tiny. And yet, if you look at the images that come out of them, those iPhones can make some images that, to use another kind of sports phrase, they punch above their weight class, right? They do things that you wouldn't think would be possible based on the physics because the camera looks at the situation and then makes a bunch of like kind of optical decisions based on those. Portrait mode is another fantastic example of AI in the camera. Traditionally, if we want a portrait with kind of some nice creamy, soft bokeh behind our subject, blur out the background. The way that we do that is with, a lens with a really wide aperture, and we stop that down so we have a shallow depth of field to make that happen. Well, again, we don't have that physics on our smartphone. But if you go into portrait mode, instead of relying on the lens to give us kind of that compression effect and that blurry background, what it's doing is it's detecting the edge of that object that you have in focus. Usually, like in a portrait, it's usually a person or maybe a pet, and so it's detecting that object, and then it's using computer decisions to basically say, okay, well, if this is the subject in the photo, if this is the subject in my portrait, all that other stuff that's, around them, behind them, I want to make that look blurry. I want to make it look like it has that bokeh. And that's a case where, again, the computers are assisting us to give us that effect in a way that we don't get straight out of the camera in that case. And I've mentioned a couple smartphone examples, and I think it's important to talk about smartphones when it comes to AI because, a lot of the kind of AI things that we run into in photography when it comes to the camera systems, especially, we see them first in the smartphone. And I've kind of hit on one of the big reasons that I think that is. And I think it's because, the smartphones don't have the physics to give us the types of images that we get out of our DSLR, out of our bigger mirrorless interchangeable lens system. And so in order for, Apple and Google and Samsung and all these other companies to be successful to sell their smartphones as, cameras, they have to get results that are acceptable to people. And so what we've seen is, a lot of these companies are investing very heavily in computational photography. And it's not just a case of, they've got some more software developers that do this, but to use the example with the iPhone, they developed a neural processing unit chip that they put into the iPhone because they discovered that kind of the general processing chip that was in there wasn't as efficient as it needed to be to perform all of these advanced kind of computational photography tasks. It used up too much battery power. It wasn't fast enough. And, when we're talking about a smartphone, battery power is very important, right? I mean, if your iPhone took great photos, but the battery only lasted an hour and a half, that wouldn't really be an acceptable solution on the market. But, and so it's like, okay, well, what if we develop a new lower power chip optimized for, neural calculations, put that in the iPhone to take care of those things, and then, that gives us, the results that we get from the iPhone today. And so we've started to see some of the kind of the more traditional camera manufacturers that we think of include more AI-based features in their cameras, whether that's, Sony, Nikon, Canon, Olympus, Panasonic, Fuji, all of these companies that we've, traditionally thought of as kind of, the quote unquote real camera companies or the bigger camera companies. We're seeing more of those AI type features, show up. And one of the things that's interesting with computational photography is your camera can get entirely new capabilities based on a firmware update or based on a software update, right? When you bought a film camera in the 1980s, or when you bought an early digital camera in the 1990s, you kind of got what you got. But, now we're at a point where as manufacturers potentially develop enhancements, they can release those via firmware updates to give us entirely new things. I believe it was, I don't recall the exact model, but one of the, the Nikon cameras, had a firmware update. I want to say it was about a year or so ago that basically added, eye detection autofocus to pets, to the camera system. It previously worked on humans, but they added pet eye autofocus through a firmware update, right? And so we're living in an age now where not only do we have all these computational abilities, but the reality is our camera can get new features without, ever leaving our studio. We just download the new update and put it on there. And, and that's kind of fascinating, right? I mean, as somebody that, if you think of photography as being kind of a physical medium, the fact that we can get entirely new capabilities just through the computers is pretty cool. So that kind of talks a little bit about, AI in our cameras. The other big place that we often see AI is like AI for our image editing. And I know in the chat at the beginning, several of you mentioned a bunch of the different types of software that you're using that have AI-based features in them right now. I know I heard reference to, Topaz Labs and their suite of plugins. I think somebody mentioned Luminar. Somebody said they were using it in Photoshop. Almost every major piece of photography software that's out there has some AI features in it now. And some of them have had them for a while, but maybe they haven't been prominently touted as AI features, for quite as long, right? I mean, let's talk about content aware fill, right? I mean, that's been in Photoshop for several years at this point, and is an interesting application because, with content aware fill, you might have a blank area in an image, or you've removed an object that was a distraction, or, you need to add some space onto the edge of your image to fit a particular aspect ratio you're trying to get to. And content aware fill is, based on the software, looking at what's in your photo, looking at what's around that area that you're trying to fill, and then making an intelligent guess as to how to best do that. And, it's gotten pretty good. It's usually pretty good. And that's one of the things with a lot of these, AI technologies and these automations and things like that is, they're not always 100% right 100% of the time, but they're usually pretty good and they usually get better over time. And so one just kind of, I would say, caution or thought that I would have is as you explore kind of these types of features in software, just know that the very first version of something you explore isn't going to be as good as the version that's probably coming in, release 2 or release 3 of that thing. The first version of portrait mode on the iPhone, which I think was back with the iPhone 8, I believe it was, was pretty rough. it was nice in concept, but like for those of us that wear glasses, it would occasionally kind of do weird things with like the glasses at the edge of our head. Or if someone had an interesting hairstyle, sometimes it would cut their head or their hair off in strange ways. And, that said, Apple's now been through multiple iterations of improving that, and it's gotten a lot better. Um, there are other applications of AI, for our editing. And again, a lot of this has to do with the software being able to figure out what is something and then what do I want to do with it. If you photograph portraits, you probably are going to be retouching those portraits in some way. And there's software on the market, and software that's been on the market for a while, that can do some automated retouching of a portrait, right? We know that if we're manually retouching a portrait, well, we're, especially if we're talking about kind of, a fashion shot or, a photo where we're trying to really flatter our subject, a lot of times we're going to be doing some skin softening. We might be doing some blemish removal. So we want to kind of soften all that out. On the other hand, we know that, a lot of times, like with the eyes in a portrait, we want to, instead of making them softer, a lot of times we want to maybe make them a little bit more crisp, give them a little bit more punch to stand out. Well, if you look at something like, the portraiture plugin that's out there for Photoshop or some other options, it can make some of these decisions for us. It can figure out, oh, these are the eyes. I want to make these a little sharper, a little punchier. And, oh, no, this is skin. I want to kind of soften and retouch this, intelligently, right? Just, we don't have to mask this out manually as photographers, but it can make those decisions on our behalf. And, masking is another great example of something that can be enhanced by AI. And Adobe released several new features in both Photoshop and Lightroom, last year that, really punched up the ability for the software to kind of intelligently make some masking decisions with, object selection and person selection and things like that, where, I don't know how many hours over the years I've spent in Photoshop masking and refining masks and using plugins to help me refine masks and all sorts of different stuff. And, hey, if the software can smartly figure out that what I'm trying to do here is to cut this person out of this background, or that I'm really trying to, select the foreground of this landscape image because I want to replace the sky. If the AI can figure all that out, great. Sky replacement. Something else that we've seen a lot of with AI. It's been a flagship feature in Luminar's software for a couple of years now, and Adobe has also put some effort into improving the sky replacement capabilities in their applications. And that's something where, again, like the first version of it really just kind of came down to intelligent masking, right, and being able to tell the difference between a sky and a foreground. But subsequent versions of some of these sky replacement algorithms have gotten a lot better, and they get smart. It's like, okay, well, I'm not just replacing the sky versus the foreground and masking it intelligently. Now I'm also kind of looking at like, what does the lighting look like, right? And if the sky, has got this orange sunsetty glow to it, that probably needs to be kind of reflected in how the foreground looks, right? And so how do I change the foreground of my scene to make it look natural based on that sky? And these are all things that you can do completely manually through your software if you want, right? But if it's going to take you to do something like that, I don't know, 90 minutes maybe, and the AI can do it in, 15 seconds, 5 seconds, even if it only maybe gets it 80% of the way there. That's the other thing is, don't dismiss a technology just because maybe it only gets it 80 or 90% of the way there. Maybe it can get it 90% of the way there and save you 90% of the time. And yeah, maybe you'll still have to do some work manually, but that gives you some interesting opportunities. Let's look at one other big area where AI can help us out, and then and that's kind of the idea of AI for image management, right? I mentioned, the idea of, face detection and person detection and being able to easily identify all of a certain people in your photo library, right? We probably all have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images in our photo collections if we're prolific photographers. And sometimes trying to find things in there can kind of be like finding a needle in a haystack. And traditionally, we might have done that with metadata and keywording and things like that. But why go through all that effort if the computer's able to start getting smarter, right? Can it, so with all that, let's talk a little bit about like the types of things that photo AI can learn and how that can help us. And so, I'm not listing all these out on the slide, but just kind of talk through some of them and some of the applications, right? So we've talked about like facial detection in camera, eye detection in camera, how that helps us with focus. One of the things that's kind of interesting, right? How many of you have ever done a group photo? And if you've done a group photo, you probably know what are the odds that you've got more than 5 people in the photo and you manage to capture a frame where everybody's eyes are open, looking at the camera, and everybody has a nice, appropriate smile with no weird smirks on their face, right? Like
Better
almost
chance of winning the
impossible.
lottery on that one.
Right. Yeah. Almost impossible. If you've done group photos, you've also done corrections to group photos. You've done head swaps. You've done things where you've, again, like, brought a different set of eyeballs across from a different particular frame because somebody had a weird half open eye in one of the frames or things like that. Well, if we can figure this all out, manually, if we can know that, okay, I've got these 5 images in a row and I need to take, the eyes from person A here and put them onto person A over there because they look better. Well, why couldn't a computer do the same thing? Facebook actually did some research that they were able to do this kind of a thing, right? Facebook has millions of images that, users have helpfully tagged to let them know exactly who they are. And so, they've been able to, take a case where somebody uploads an image of a group of people and maybe one of these people's eyes are closed. Well, if they know who that person is and they've got 1,000 other images of that person where they've got the eyes open, the computer can kind of automatically swap that and make it look like somebody's got their eyes open. We talked about general object detection kind of beyond faces. This is being able to tell me, if you open up your iPhone right now and you go into your Photos app and you search for sunset, it'll find photos you've taken of sunsets, even if you've never keyworded them, tagged them, put captions on them, or anything like that. It's because it knows kind of what a sunset looks like, and it knows the attributes of that. Talked about content aware fill. It can fill and it can blend photos in realistic ways. I mentioned the night mode or night sight options that let us take pictures in the dark almost with our smartphones. One of the ways that happens is not that when you take a night mode photo that it captures one perfect frame, but a lot of those capabilities of your smartphone cameras are based on that camera capturing a lot of different images and then blending them in intelligent ways. We know that like a longer exposure is going to let in more light, which is great, which a lot of times we need to make a good image. But we also know that a longer exposure introduces the option for, motion blur of the subjects in the image or, camera shake if we're not holding the phone or the camera quite still. And so, AI can kind of combine these things in intelligent ways and like bring in more light, but also be able to detect that like, oh, this is out of focus. This isn't quite clear. So I don't want to, use that part of that image. Another thing that's kind of interesting that AI can figure out is between the multiple images, which image is, quote unquote, better. And this is an area where Google released a research paper, a few years ago, where they took a set of, a lot of photos. I'm trying to remember the exact number. I want to say it was like 800 photos, got a couple hundred people, and basically they had those people take photos side by side. It's like, which is this photo or that photo a better photo? Is it more visually appealing? Things like that. And then they kind of gave a computer algorithm that same task and said, hey, rank these, not rank these photos, but, is this one or this one better? And what they found, I'm trying to remember the exact statistic. I want to say it was about 82%, 80%. The computer could identify with the same result that the people came up with, which brings some interesting questions to mind, right? So one is that, software can help us find our best images now, if that's the case. Software can help us kind of color images. There are products on the market today. There's one called Aftershoot that essentially does AI-based culling of a large quantity of images, right? So if you're a wedding shooter and you come back from a wedding with 4,000 images because, you and your second shooter were there for 8 hours. Aftershoot can go through and start to kind of classify those and be like, oh, these ones look like, these look like duplicates. These look like they're maybe have exposure issues, too bright, too dim, these maybe are out of focus, things like that. And so this is another area where AI is going to be help save us some time as photographers. And then kind of one little twist with AI being able to identify which image is better that I always like to throw out here. And this is just a philosophical question. But so if Google can tell which photos are better, should Google use that as a ranking factor for photographers' websites in the search engines? Right. So if I'm trying to compete with other photographers in my area, let's say, hypothetically, I were a wedding photographer in Portland. If someone searches for wedding photographer in Portland, should Google boost the search engine rankings of photographers whose images, at least according to an AI algorithm, are quote unquote better than another photographer whose images aren't as quite as good? It's interesting.
That question.
Right. And there's not a right answer. I mean, on one level, you might be like, well, yeah, I mean, if they're a better photographer, they should rank higher. But then on the other hand, we also know that pure image quality is not the only thing involved in making a decision around hiring a wedding photographer, for example, right? I mean, if somebody makes fantastic photos, but they're a jerk or they're a flake, or they can, they have dissatisfied customers all the time, or their website hosts a lot of malware and viruses or any other number of things that could also affect, their search engine rankings. And so, again, there's not a right or a wrong answer, but it's an interesting topic of conversation. So with all of these things that we've talked about, are there any questions burning in your mind about this type of stuff, whether it's in your camera, in your software, in your image management? Because the last little segment that I then kind of have is kind of looking towards the future and where I think we're going. But before we do that, feel free to drop a question into the chat if you've got one right now. And
yeah, we've got a couple of them.
Okay.
One from Max wants to know when big camera makers are going to start using some of the computational photo settings on their pro cameras. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard to say. And I was just reading an article. I don't remember which website it was on. It might have been on Petapixel in the last week or so, where somebody was kind of exploring that. And, I think we will start to see more of it because I think those camera manufacturers, they obviously have a continued business interest in selling us more cameras. And so the market is going to demand those features out of those cameras, right? If we get to a point where I can do something with my, $1,000 iPhone that I can't do on, say, Nikon's $6,000 flagship Pro DSLR or Pro mirrorless camera, the market's going to react to that, right? Photographers are going to demand that these companies give them these features, especially when they know that, hey, my kid's, phone that they mostly use for texting has got this capability. And so we will start to see more of that. I think a lot of it will kind of depend on, what the particular type of feature is. I think there are a lot of opportunities in, especially in pro cameras for some of these things, like automatic blink removal or, things like that. Heck, if I'm an event shooter, I would love to have automatic blink removal in my camera, right? So the camera just does that. I don't even have to think about it. That would be fantastic. So hopefully we will start to see more of that soon.
Got a question from Michael. I'm assuming LinkedIn, Instagram, etc. uses AI in some way to help select hashtags. Do you know if that's true at all?
I think they do. I don't know that it's specifically based on the images themselves in most cases, with, at least to what I know of Instagram's algorithm, which they've started to get a little more transparent about. Not saying they keep it consistent, but they're fairly transparent about kind of how it's based. Like with Instagram, it's really more about the photos you interact with, the hashtags that are on the photos you interact with, the accounts that you interact with, and things like that, as opposed to them doing, a lot of AI inference of, what's in the image or things like that. So.
Okay, got a question from Max. At some point, will AI just eliminate the need for professional photographers?
That is a perfect lead into this final segment, looking at the future. So should I make that leap right now, and then we can hit any other questions right afterwards?
We can totally do that. Yep.
Perfect. So yeah, I mean, right? Are we going to get automated out of a job? Right? I mean, that's a very real question that I think photographers are asking. And it's a valid question, right? Like, there have been lots of jobs over the years that have gone away due to automation of various forms. We see it we see it around us right now, right? I can walk into, a McDonald's and interact with a computerized kiosk and never talk to anybody at the counter and order a Big Mac. Or I can go to the grocery store and take my groceries up to the self-checkout lane, scan them myself, and walk away without ever talking to a checker. What about photography, right? Are people going to end up at a point where they hire a wedding photographer robot or a device that does their wedding photography instead of hiring a wedding photographer? So, kind of here's what I would say to that. I don't think AI technology is going to automate photographers out of a photography career. I don't think they're going to automate photographers out of a job, at least any time in our lifetimes. I mean, I can't say what's going to happen 200 years in the future, but in the probably 50 years I've got left here, I'm not concerned that that's going to be a big deal. What is going to happen, and what is already happening, is that AI and technology are going to eliminate some of the tasks that you do as a photographer. So a few examples of this. I made reference to the automated photo culling software, right? So if you currently have maybe an assistant, or if it's something that you do where you come back from a shoot and you spend several hours culling through your photos, making your selects, eliminating the bad ones, flagging the ones that maybe you want to show to a client or start some retouching on, I think that's a task that probably within 5 years is going to be substantially automated for most like mainstream photographers. Here's another good example. Product photographers, where essentially what they're doing is very straightforward, just like small object on a white background catalog type photography. Square, the credit card processing company, probably some of you who are listening to this right now use it for your photo businesses. They've got a little reader that you can use with your smartphone, or a kiosk that we've all interacted with at some sort of small business, I'm sure. Square now offers a service called Square Photo Studio. And, if you're a Square customer and you need that sort of product photography I just referenced, I don't know, maybe you sell little widgets or toys or objects or whatever of some sort, you can send them to Square. They've developed essentially an automated system where, someone sets that object on the white background, robotic camera shoots it from multiple angles. They replace it with the next object, push a button, the robot does the same thing and all that. And they do that. I think they do that at a rate of basically about $3 an image. I think it's $9.99 for 3 images. If you're a professional product photographer and that's what you do, I'm guessing you're not running a viable business on $9.99 for 3 images. And so that's a case where, if what the photographer is offering is a kind of a commodity canned service that is highly like tech or process dependent and not very creativity dependent or customized dependent, those are the sort of tasks and jobs that might get automated away by technology. Because if we look at where do jobs get automated away, it's usually when a human is doing some sort of similar process over and over and over again without a lot of variance, without a lot of customization, without a lot of creativity. And so, if we look at what does that mean for professional photography, I think the take is that, and this has always kind of been smart advice, but I think especially going forward in the future, where you're really going to set yourself apart as a successful professional photographer is in being able to offer, creative, unique, customized solutions for your client with whatever genre of photography that is, that are the kinds of things that, that can't be automated, right? If you do like fun photo booths at events, okay, you can probably still get hired to do that. but I can also buy a box for about $1,000 that I set on a tripod, and it will do 100% fun photo booth photos at events that the guests can interact with entirely on their own. And after just a gig or two, that probably pays for itself versus hiring a photographer over and over again. So again, that kind of repetitive stuff that doesn't have a lot of creativity to it or doesn't have a lot of customization or uniqueness to it, those are the sort of things that we're more likely to start seeing get automated away. So focus on the creativity, embrace using automation and technology for the things where the things where it makes sense, right? The areas where you can save time, the area where you can stop doing dumb stuff that you just is kind of menial, tedious work, and focus on the areas that are going to give you better results going forward, offering those kind of more custom solutions. Chris mentioned, I wrote a book on this. It's called The Computer Ate My Photos, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Photography. You can get it at Amazon. It's available in paperback, available in Kindle. I'll go and throw that up there as well. If you go to ai.techphotoguy.com, you can, there's links there to buy the book, but you can also download a free sample chapter all about kind of AI generated artwork and how that might impact photographers going forward. So that's totally free. You can get that there. And there's my website and my email address. I'm always happy for, if people want to follow up, ask me questions, share something cool that they did or that they ran into, and with that,
I'm also
kind of open,
sending out in the follow-up email all of these links as well as an Amazon link directly to your book, Aaron. That way, if you don't have a pen handy, you can still get that. It'll be coming to your email. And that's automated.
Perfect. No. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's magic. You go place the order and it shows up at your house. Who knows how it happens?
Don't ask questions. So I've got a question from Tim.
Yeah.
Can you discuss the ethics involved with developing and applying AI?
Oh, in 5 minutes?
High level overview here.
Yeah. So super high level, because that's a whole thing. And especially when we're talking about like photographic or image based AI, camera based AI, a lot of the ethical concerns with artificial intelligence really come down to being cognizant that, the training data, the learning that we give the AI leads to the output, right? And, if you've been in the computer world for any time, you may have heard of a phrase, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And what it talks about is that, if you put bad inputs into a system, you get bad inputs out of a system. And so a lot of the ethical considerations with AI in general, but also with photo-based AI, come down to ensuring that the inputs that are put into systems to do things like facial recognition, to do things like object recognition, are appropriate inputs and are equitable inputs and things like that. One, probably the broadest category of like current right now ethical problems with a photo-based AI situation is that right now, when it comes to like facial recognition, almost all the algorithms on the market do a much better job accurately identifying lighter skin, Caucasian, white people faces than they do darker skin, whether that's, African American or Hispanic or some Asian cultures or Indian or things like that. And the result of that is that if decisions are being made based on that photo-based AI, whether that's identifying somebody for like an automated camera ticketing system, whether that's the police using a facial recognition database to try and identify a suspect, the disparities in that capability of the AI, lead to potentially some, life-changing effects, right? If my photo management system misidentifies a photo of my son, that's unfortunate. And I'll get over it. If a police, facial recognition database misidentifies a murder suspect and they then go issue an arrest warrant and break into somebody's house to try and arrest him for the murder, best case is they've arrested the wrong person. Worst case is that something goes wrong with that arrest and, maybe the person gets shot and killed. based on a facial recognition misidentification. And so these are some of the ethical concerns that exist. And, that kind of specific example is, where, a lot of localities have kind of put a pause on the government using AI and facial recognition for, the time being until they can sort some of this stuff out. But the ethical concerns are real. Like I said, different places have kind of different stakes of when things might go wrong. But it is something that I think just as a society and as photographers who can kind of understand some of the image side of it, we have a duty to, just make sure that people are using this stuff responsibly.
So, question may be coming home where a lot of us are image competition type folks. How would you feel about like an AI that comes through and says, make my image score an 80? How do we get to merit on there? And it could take an okay image and apply whatever cropping effects or processing or post-production's needed to it to get us up there. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating discussion, and it's one that I've had with a couple other like formal image competition judges. At some point, lines have to be drawn in, the rules, right? And there are already like lines drawn in the rules around like, what types of images are you allowed to make, and things like that. But, what we see with image competition and, it's like, oh, what did this person like hand paint this image to make it look painterly, or did they just use a Photoshop plugin to make it look like a painting in one click? Well, competition judges have to kind of try and get savvy to start to distinguish some of that. And it's the same kind of thing with, other technologies. I was talking with a Professional Photographers of America competition judge a couple months ago, and they mentioned last year's image competition. They recognized seeing the same canned sky replacement at a Luminar in 5 different images in a week. Okay, well, if you're doing that, you're not going to be scoring high in the creativity and, things like that. If there was a way to run a program that I think would magically make an image score better in image competition, that's kind of hard to say, right? That said, there's programs that you can run that can enhance your photos in general right now, right? And so it really comes down to where do you draw that line.
So let me throw another thing at you. We're getting some chat on here. What about like an AI judge? Oh, this is based on all the data that we have, because there's lots of it. Right. This is going to be merit level. This is not merit level.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? And you look at it, I kind of mentioned that algorithm that Google put together where it could kind of like, oh, between these 2 images, which is better, right? But what if you extrapolate that out, right? If I've got, 10 potential images that I'm considering as using as my competition material, but I only get to enter 4 of them, what if I tell the computer to tell me the best 4, right? Is that a problem? If I made all the images, like, is it really a problem if I asked a computer to tell me the best 4? I don't know. It is something where I think, when we look at, rules around images, and like the whole field of photojournalism is another interesting area, right? Because that's an industry that has, both written and kind of unwritten ethical rules around what is appropriate for a photojournalistic image. At some point as technology advances and changes, the rule makers, whether that be formal or informal, will kind of need to address that, right? Let's say that camera comes out that can do automatic blink fixing. Could I use a camera with automatic, eye blink fixing capabilities and still be considered as a photojournalistically accurate image by a major news service or not? I bet people could argue either way on that one, but like,
this is a fun debate.
Yeah. Like, and that's the kind of thing when we start talking about the future stuff is it's like, it could go in so many different places. And, what's funny, I gave a presentation on the similar type topics, actually to ASP, the American Society of Photographers, 3-4 months ago. And in the Q&A afterwards, somebody asked me, well, what does this mean for a purist like me? And I kind of dodged his question by turning it back around and asking him a bunch of questions. It's like, well, what does purist mean, right? Because, are you not a purist if you ever use anything other than manual mode in your camera? If you shoot an aperture priority, does that mean you're not a purist? Or if you use autofocus, are you not a purist? If you if you ever shoot in JPEG instead of RAW, are you not a purist? I mean, like, a lot of these kind of rules and conventions are kind of arbitrary, just based on what we accept or our history with photography. And so, yeah, so many fun questions to ask. These are great topics to, sit around a bar with a beverage and a few photographers and argue about.
Get into it. We're almost out of time, but I do have one last question from Michael. Do you know of a website that's not using AI in a correct or good way? Like Facebook
Webs.
or Instagram or things like that, that are maybe using it for
Oh,
evil or going too far with it?
yeah. I mean, again, this is really subjective. Ultimately, I mean, as far as AI specifically, I don't know that I can point. I mean, I think the biggest issues, and we see this across multiple social media platforms right now, is that social media platforms' algorithms are generally designed for engagement, right? They want to promote and feature the stuff on their services so that when people log into their services, they spend as much time there, whether that's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whoever. The problem is that often what drives the most engagement might be content that's harmful either in the short term or the long term to an individual or maybe just to society as a whole. And so if we let the algorithm just drive based on maybe a singular metric or a singular set of metrics, there has to kind of be that, that conscious, that ethical oversight to be like, okay, well, great, this drove engagement. And I will leave with a specific example of this. So Facebook releases a quarterly kind of, they call it a transparency report about what's gone on the service and things like that. Their quarterly transparency report that they released just a few days ago indicated that for the last 3 months, it identified the most popular Facebook pages. The number one on that page, on that list, is a page that has been removed from Facebook because it violated Facebook's community guidelines. So the most popular page on all of Facebook is something that's now been removed, and they won't say what it is. They won't tell anybody what this page actually was. And so, like, giant red flag where you have to kind of wonder if the algorithms or whatever happened got that page that popular, but that page also violated the guidelines to the point where it was completely removed from the system. Is that system working? I would say probably not.
Cool. Well, thank you so very, very much, Aaron. Holy cow, that was a ton of information and really, really cool ways to start thinking about how we can embrace some of this technology and what to look for as we move forward with it. I know that just looking at the discussions here that are in that chat, definitely some fascinating things and ideas that are just kind of brewing and spinning. So that getting a beer is definitely a good idea for figuring that one out. So I do have some prizes to give away, and then we'll kind of touch back here in just a second. But I want to give a shout out to American Color Imaging again, and they do have a special if you are watching. So right now you've got kind of a tiered system going on: $10 off a $50 purchase, $25 off a $100 purchase, $75 off a $250, or $200 off a $500 purchase. There's some fine print below on what you can't get with that, but almost everything's game on there. So make sure you're using that code, and it does expire on the 4th of next month. So be sure to write that one down, and that is also coming to you in your email, just in case you can't write that quickly. So do want to give away some prizes now. So up first, we've got a $50 lab credit to ACI, and let's see who that winner is. Hey, looks like Sheila. So congratulations, Sheila, on that one. We've got our next prize coming up, and that one's going to be a $75 lab credit. $75 lab credit. And is a prize wheel an AI process? That was from Tim asking that one. This is from an app called Wheel of Names, and I put in everybody's name that registers on here, so we can see on there. I don't know if it's AI, but it's selecting it, so potentially. And Daniel's the winner of that one. And now we've got our final prize, and that is a $100 lab credit to ACI. And let's see who the winner on that one is. And looks like it's Stephanie. Awesome. Okay, so I do want to let you know about the upcoming shows that we've got. Up next on our lineup is going to be Print Competition Pitfalls with PG, and he's going to be walking through, when it comes to image competition, what we're looking for. And then we've got Selling Portrait Paintings with Sherry Hammond, and she's going to be going through her process in terms of how she sells it and uses that as an upsell opportunity with her clients. If you do have ideas for future episodes, things that you would like to see, all of that fun stuff, please email me. My email address is hello@cwooley.com. We come up with the speakers and the content based on your feedback. So if there's something you want to know more about or a particular speaker that you want to see, please make sure to reach out to me so that we can get that. Phew, that was really exciting, Aaron. We're back at you. Just wanted to say thank you so very, very much. This is a fascinating topic on here, and based on the audience's comments, they're really loving it.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks again to ACI. And the beauty of this topic is that it's ever evolving. We could have this discussion again in 2 years from now, and we'd have a whole new set of things to talk about. So it's fun stuff.
I can't wait for next time on that one.
Sounds good.
All right, have a good night, everybody.